Okay, I just would like to talk for a few minutes about a subject that is very familiar to you, since it's interpreting. So if we start from the very basics, we could say, what is interpreting? Well, it's the production of translation from one type of language into another, from a source language, and this is translated into another language on the basis of one-time exposure. So basically, as everybody knows, or most people know, there are two fundamental forms of interpreting. One is simultaneous, and the other is consecutive. The basic difference between these two is that in simultaneous interpreting, you translate immediately via electronic equipment, whereas in consecutive, you take notes, and very often there's a break in the exposure to the source language. If we look back at the past, we can see that in fact there are very few historical records that refer to interpreting, and this is probably because the written word has always been dominant, especially for historians. Another issue, in fact, is that interpreting has generally been regarded just in a certain sense as relatively low status, a service that is given, and in the past was often done, for example, via a servant. If we look at the development of originally in the 19th century or before the 19th century, there was very little need, in fact, for interpreting, especially at least in diplomatic circles, because the lingua franca at that time was French. Things changed later on, and with a move away from consecutive towards simultaneous. First technology in simultaneous interpreting was developed in America in the 20s and 30s, and this was a combination of an American businessman called Edward Filene and a British engineer called Alan Finley, and they developed equipment along with IBM. And for example, there was a conference in the Soviet Union in 1935 using simultaneous translation, and after this conference, IBM sold on the equipment to the United Nations. Perhaps the most famous book on interpreting was written by a Russian called Pavel Palashchenko. He wrote a book some time ago called My Years with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. And in this book, he refers to the developments away from consecutive translation and towards simultaneous. Before the war, which was the period in which consecutive interpreting dominated, there were famous people, like Antoine Vellman, Jean Herbert, and in particular the Kaminka brothers. At that time, the interpreter could never interrupt the speaker, who might well often speak for 20 or 30 minutes. And so the interpreting was done by heavy use of symbols and abbreviations, etc. Probably the world record is held by Andrei Kaminka, who once interpreted a French diplomat's speech that lasted for 2.5 hours without interruption. Maybe I'll stop there. You were listening to Ali, were you? You were listening to Ali, yeah?
Thank you. Did you take notes to do it as a consec?